The alarm on the bridge of the Halcyon cut through the silence before I had even finished my morning reading of the star charts. Red light washed over the control panels. Every screen around me flickered with the same warning. An unknown vessel had entered the edge of our patrol zone, moving faster than any scout ship had a right to move, and it was not slowing down. My name is Kalen Thray. I am a liaison officer from the Corvi Assembly, assigned to observe and advise aboard this human warship as part of the new alliance between our peoples. I had spent 6 years studying humans before I ever set foot on one of their ships, and I believed, foolishly, that 6 years of study had prepared me for what I would see. It had not. I gripped the edge of my console as the ship shifted course, the deck tilting under my feet with a smoothness that still unsettled me. Human engineering did not creak or groan the way our vessels did. It simply obeyed, silent and immediate, like a blade cutting through water. Commander Grant Doyle stood at the center of the bridge, arms folded, watching the tactical display without a trace of alarm on his face. I had learned in my short time aboard the Halcyon that this was normal for him. Where my own people would have raised our voices and called for immediate defensive formations, Doyle simply narrowed his eyes and asked a single question. "Identify it," he said. The answer came back within seconds. Not a warship, not a threat, a derelict transport, drifting without power, caught in the gravity well of a nearby moon. The Halcyon had reacted to a ghost. I felt my pulse begin to slow, but around me, the human crew did not relax the way I expected. They did not sigh with relief or laugh off the false alarm. Instead, they simply returned to their stations with the same calm focus they had shown moments before, as if the difference between a threat and no threat was nothing more than a small adjustment to their day. This was the thing about humans that no report, no historical record, no warning from other species had ever fully captured. It was not that they were fearless. I had seen fear in their eyes before, in quiet moments, in private conversations. It was that fear did not seem to change what they did next. It simply sat beside them while they worked. I had been assigned to the Halcyon 3 months earlier, following the signing of the alliance between the Corvi Assembly and the human coalition known as the Continuum. My superiors had chosen me for this posting because I had spent my career studying Deathworld species, planets where evolution did not produce gentle creatures, but hungry ones. Humanity's homeworld, according to every survey we had ever conducted, should not have produced intelligent life at all. The gravity was too strong. The predators were too numerous. The climate shifted too violently, too often, for any species to develop the patience needed for civilization. And yet here they were, flying starships, shaking hands with alien delegates, laughing at jokes that made no sense to me, and reacting to a dead transport ship with less emotion than I felt when someone spilled a drink in the officer's mess. I had read the old reports from the First Contact era, the accounts written by explorers and diplomats who had encountered humans before the wider galaxy understood what they were. Those reports used words like unpredictable and volatile. Later reports, written after several small conflicts had been resolved in humanity's favor despite overwhelming odds, used a different word. That word was Deathworlders. It was not affectionate. It was not respectful either. It was the word you used for something you did not fully understand and hoped never to provoke. My task aboard the Halcyon was simple in theory. I was to observe human military culture, record their training methods, their command structures, their approach to conflict, and report back to the Assembly so that our two peoples could better coordinate in the growing tensions along the border with the Threshold Compact, a coalition of species who did not share our appetite for peace. In practice, my task felt more like trying to catalog a storm by standing inside it. The bridge settled back into its rhythm. Doyle returned to his console, speaking quietly with the navigation officer, a woman named Priya Nandi, about adjusting their patrol route to avoid further false alarms from debris fields near the moon. I found myself watching him rather than listening to the conversation. Doyle was not a large man. He did not carry himself with the exaggerated posture that some human officers use to project authority. He simply stood still, and somehow that stillness commanded the room more effectively than shouting ever could. It was during this quiet moment that the ship's intercom chimed, and a voice I did not yet recognize requested permission to dock. A supply shuttle had arrived from the nearest human outpost, carrying replacement parts, fresh provisions, and according to the manifest, a single new crew member being transferred aboard. I did not think much of it at the time. Crew transfers happened often enough on a ship like the Halcyon, which served as both a patrol vessel and a training platform for new recruits, before they were assigned to combat postings. I returned to my charts, expecting nothing more than another quiet arrival, another young human face among the many I had already begun to lose track of. I was wrong to expect nothing. I simply did not know it yet. The shuttle docked without incident, and I made my way down to the receiving bay out of habit rather than necessity. Part of my role required me to greet new arrivals, to introduce myself as the assembly liaison, and to answer any questions they might have about serving alongside a non-human observer. Most new recruits were curious about me in the way children are curious about anything unfamiliar. They asked about my homeworld, about whether Corvi had 2 hearts or 4, about why my voice carried a slight resonance that human throats could not produce. I had grown used to these questions, and I had grown to enjoy answering them. The bay doors opened, and the new recruit stepped through carrying a single duffel bag over one shoulder, her boots striking the deck plating with a quiet, even rhythm. She was young, younger than most recruits I had seen assigned to a ship like the Halcyon, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that moved across the bay in a slow, careful sweep before settling on nothing in particular. She did not look nervous. She did not look excited either. She looked like someone taking inventory. "Kara Lang," she said, offering her hand to the receiving officer, before he had even finished reading her name from his data slate, reporting for training assignment. I stepped forward, introduced myself in the way I always did, and watched her expression shift only slightly, a small flicker of interest crossing her face as she studied me. Most humans took a moment to adjust to my appearance, the slight elongation of my limbs, the faint blue undertone of my skin, the eyes that sat a little too far apart by human standards. Kara Lang did not flinch, did not stare, did not ask any of the usual questions. She simply nodded once, as if filing the information away for later, and asked where she needed to report next. I found this unusual, though I did not think much of it at the time. I told myself that she was simply focused, perhaps nervous, in a way that did not show on the surface, eager to begin her assignment without delay. I had no way of knowing then that this quiet, careful focus was the truest thing about her, the one part of her character that would never change no matter what she faced in the months ahead. Her file, which I reviewed later that evening in my quarters, told a story that was almost aggressively ordinary. She had grown up on one of the Human Coalition's frontier settlements, a place called Ashford Hollow, known for harsh winters and a population too small to support much beyond basic agriculture and mineral extraction. Her early education records showed nothing exceptional. Average marks in most subjects, slightly above average in physical training exercises that seemed, by human standards, there was no mention of prior combat experience, no note of disciplinary issues, no flag of any kind that might explain why a Corvi officer studying Deathworld psychology would feel a faint, persistent unease every time he reread her file. It was not the content of the file that unsettled me. It was the absence of anything in it. Every human I had studied so far carried some visible marker of their upbringing on a hostile world. A scar from an accident, a note about surviving an extreme weather event, a mention of losing family members to disease or disaster. Kara Lang's file contained none of this. It read as though she had simply grown up, quietly and without incident, in a place that I knew for a fact was capable of killing the unprepared within hours. I mentioned this observation to Doyle during our evening briefing, more out of professional habit than genuine concern. He glanced at the file over my shoulder, scanned it for perhaps 3 seconds, and shrugged in the loose, unbothered way that humans used when a topic did not interest them. "Ashford Hollow kids don't write about the bad stuff," he said. "They just live through it and move on." "You'll learn that about us eventually, Thray. We don't always put the important parts in the report." I asked him what he meant by the important parts, and he only smiled, the expression carrying none of the warmth I had come to associate with human smiles when they were genuine. This one was closer to something else, something I did not yet have a word for. He told me I would understand soon enough, and then he changed the subject to the ship's upcoming patrol schedule, leaving me with a question I would not find the answer to for several more weeks. That night, I found myself unable to sleep, a rare occurrence for my species, who typically rest without difficulty regardless of external stress. I lay in my quarters and thought about the way Kara Lang had looked at me in the receiving bay, that slow, careful sweep of her eyes, before settling on nothing in particular. I had seen that same expression before, in the field reports of Corvi scouts who had encountered predators on hostile worlds and lived to describe the encounter. It was the expression of someone constantly measuring the distance between themselves and danger, even in a place as safe and orderly as a starship's receiving bay. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was projecting my own anxieties about serving among humans onto a single young recruit who had done nothing more than fail to ask me the usual questions about my homeworld. I told myself this several times, and each time, the reassurance felt a little less convincing than the last. The following morning, the Halcyon resumed its patrol along the border sector, a quiet stretch of space that had seen little activity since the alliance with the Corvi Assembly had been signed. I spent most of the day in the observation deck, reviewing sensor logs and drafting my weekly report for the Assembly, a task that had grown increasingly difficult as I found myself struggling to summarize human behavior in language my superiors would find useful. How do you explain, in a formal report, that a species reacts to danger not with panic, but with a strange, focused calm that somehow feels more unsettling than panic would? How do you explain that their children grow up on worlds capable of killing them in a dozen different ways before breakfast, and yet write nothing about it in their official records because, to them, survival is simply what happens, not something worth documenting? I did not find good answers to these questions that day. I would find them soon enough, though not in the way I expected, and not in language that would fit comfortably into any report I could send back to the Assembly. It was during the final hour of my shift that I first heard mention of the training schedule that would change everything. Priya Nandi, reviewing the day's roster changes, mentioned in passing that the new recruit, Kara Lang, had been assigned to begin combat training under Doyle's direct supervision, starting the following morning. This was not unusual in itself. Doyle personally oversaw the training of most new recruits during their first weeks aboard the Halcyon, a practice he had maintained since taking command, believing that a commander who did not know his crew's capabilities firsthand was not fit to lead them into danger. What caught my attention was not the assignment itself, but the tone in Nandi's voice as she mentioned it, a faint note of something between amusement and anticipation that I had learned to associate with humans expecting to witness something interesting. I asked her what she meant by that tone, and she only laughed, a short, quiet sound, and told me that Doyle's training sessions were never boring, especially not the first ones. I did not think much of this warning at the time. I filed it away alongside the other small, unexplained comments I had collected during my months aboard the Halcyon, the half-finished sentences, the knowing looks exchanged between crew members, the sense that there was an entire layer of human experience running beneath the surface of their daily routines that I had not yet learned to read. That night, I reviewed my notes one final time before retiring to my quarters, and I found myself returning again and again to a single passage in an old assembly report on Deathworld species, written decades before humanity had ever made formal contact with the wider galaxy. The passage read simply that species evolved under extreme survival pressure do not distinguish clearly between practice and reality, because on their homeworlds, the distinction rarely mattered. A mistake made in training could kill you just as easily as a mistake made in true danger, and so their instincts, shaped by generations of hardship, refused to draw a line between the two. I had read this passage many times before, always as an abstract point of academic interest, a curiosity to be noted and set aside. That night, for the first time, I found myself reading it as a warning, though I still did not fully understand what it was warning me about. I closed my data slate, extinguished the lights in my quarters, and lay awake far longer than my species typically required, staring at the ceiling and thinking about a quiet young woman named Kara Lang, who had looked at me in the receiving bay with the eyes of someone measuring distance, and who would, in less than 12 hours, step onto a training deck, under an order that no one aboard the Halcyon yet understood the true weight of. I did not know, as I finally drifted into a restless sleep, that I was about to witness something that would change the way I understood my closest allies forever. I did not know that the calm, ordinary young woman from a frontier settlement called Ashford Hollow was about to teach an entire ship, and eventually an entire galaxy, exactly what it meant when a Deathworlder took an order seriously. I only knew that morning was coming, and that some part of me, some quiet instinct I could not fully explain, was already afraid of what it would bring. Morning aboard the Halcyon began the same way it always did, with the soft chime of the ship's internal clock and the gradual brightening of the corridor lights, to simulate a sunrise none of us would ever see through actual glass. I woke earlier than usual, my mind still turning over the events of the previous evening, and made my way toward the training deck long before my shift officially required it. The training deck occupied the lower section of the Halcyon, a wide, reinforced chamber lined with padded flooring and adjustable barriers that could be reconfigured for different exercises. I had visited it several times before, mostly to observe standard fitness routines and weapons drills, activities that, while impressive by Corvi standards, had never struck me as particularly remarkable. Humans trained the way they did everything else, with a focused intensity that seemed to burn hotter than necessary, and then they simply stopped, showered, and returned to their duties as though nothing unusual had occurred. When I arrived, the deck was already occupied by a handful of crew members, stretching and preparing for the day's exercises. Among them I spotted Owen Pratt, a broad-shouldered engineer who occasionally assisted with combat training when his regular duties allowed, and Lena Marsh, a communications officer known throughout the ship for her competitive streak during sparring matches. Both of them glanced toward the entrance as I stepped inside, and both of them wore the same faint, knowing expression I had seen on Nandy's face the previous day. "Here to watch the new recruit?" Pratt asked, tightening a strap on his glove. I admitted that I was, and he laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried no real humor in it. "Should be interesting," he said, echoing Nandy's words from the day before almost exactly. "Doyle doesn't usually run new arrivals through a full sparring match on their first day. Guess he wants to see what Ashford Hollow sends us." I asked him what he meant by that, and he only shrugged, the same casual dismissal I had grown used to receiving whenever I asked humans to explain the deeper meaning behind their comments. I was beginning to understand that this was simply how humans communicated important information, wrapped in vague hints and half-explanations, expecting the listener to piece together the full picture through observation rather than direct explanation. It was, I would later realize, remarkably similar to how their instincts worked as well. Kara Lang arrived precisely on time, dressed in the standard training uniform issued to all new recruits, her hair pulled back tightly, her expression as unreadable as it had been the day before. She moved through the small crowd gathered near the entrance, with the same quiet, measured pace I had noticed in the receiving bay, acknowledging the other crew members with brief nods, but offering no unnecessary conversation. Doyle entered a few minutes later, carrying a data slate that he set aside almost immediately upon reaching the center of the training deck. He surveyed the gathered crew with the same still, commanding presence I had observed on the bridge, and then he turned his attention to Kara Lang, studying her for a long moment before speaking. "Lang," he said. "Ashford Hollow." "Yes, sir," she replied. "Tough place to grow up." It was not a question, but Kara answered it as though it were, her tone level and without embellishment. "It has its challenges, sir." Doyle nodded slowly, something in his expression shifting that I could not fully interpret, and then he addressed the wider group, his voice carrying easily across the training deck without needing to be raised. "Every new recruit runs a sparring evaluation on their first week aboard this ship," he said. "It tells me more about how you'll perform under real pressure than any written test ever could. I want to see how you move, how you think, and most importantly, how you handle a situation when you can't simply walk away from it." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the gathered crew before continuing. "I've heard some of you talk about easing the new arrivals into these evaluations, taking it slow the first time, letting them find their footing before pushing harder. I understand it's a kind one, but it does the recruit no favors in the long run, and out here, kindness that doesn't prepare you for reality is just another kind of danger." The training deck had grown quiet, the usual quiet chatter and stretching sounds fading, as the crew focused entirely on Doyle's words. I found myself listening with the same intensity, sensing, though I could not yet articulate why, that this moment carried more weight than the routine briefings I had grown accustomed to. "So here's how we're going to run things from now on," Doyle continued. "No mercy in sparring. Full intensity, full effort, every single time. I don't want to see anyone holding back because they're worried about hurting a training partner, and I don't want to see anyone treating these matches like a formality to get through before the real work begins. Out here, past this ship, past this patrol, the things we'll face won't hold back for us. I'd rather my crew learn that lesson on a padded floor with a medic standing by than learn it for the first time in a situation where there's no one standing by at all. I glanced around the training deck, studying the reactions of the assembled crew. Most of them nodded, some with quiet determination, others with the faint, resigned expressions of people who had heard some version of this speech before and understood it as a familiar, if intense, part of their training culture. Pratt exchanged a glance with Marsh, both of them adjusting their stance slightly, preparing themselves mentally for a harder session than they might have expected. Kara Lang did not react in any of these ways. She simply listened, her expression unchanged, her posture unshifted, absorbing the order the way she seemed to absorb everything, quietly and completely, without any visible processing taking place on the surface. I remember thinking, in that moment, that she looked less like a recruit receiving instructions from her commanding officer, and more like someone confirming information she had already known to be true. Doyle assigned the pairings for the day's sparring evaluations, working through the list with brisk efficiency. Pratt was paired against a fellow engineer, Marsh against one of the ship's junior tactical officers, and several other combinations followed, each pairing chosen, I would later learn, to test specific aspects of a recruit's adaptability and instinct. When Doyle reached Kara Lang's name, he paused for a moment, studying her again, with that same unreadable expression from earlier, before announcing her pairing. Lang, you're against Reyes. Callum Reyes stepped forward from the gathered crew, a tall, experienced crew member who had served aboard the Halcyon for several years and had, according to the quiet comments I overheard around me, won more sparring evaluations than any other member of the current crew roster. He was not unkind in his demeanor, offering Kara a brief nod of acknowledgement as he stepped onto the padded training circle, but there was a confidence in his posture that suggested he did not expect this particular match to challenge him significantly. I found myself moving closer to the edge of the training circle, driven by a curiosity I could not fully suppress, eager to see how this quiet, unreadable young recruit from a frontier settlement would handle her first real test aboard the ship. I was not the only one drawn closer. Pratt and Marsh, having finished preparing for their own matches, drifted toward the circle as well, along with several other crew members who had heard, through whatever quiet channel humans use to spread information faster than official announcements ever could, that this particular match might be worth watching. Doyle took his position at the edge of the circle, arms folded, his expression giving away nothing of what he expected to see. He called the standard readiness check, confirming that both participants understood the rules of engagement, the boundaries of the circle, and the medical protocols in place, should either combatant require assistance. Reyes answered with the easy confidence of someone who had gone through this ritual many times before. Kara answered with the same quiet, level tone she had used throughout the entire briefing. Understood, sir. I studied her posture as she settled into position, noting details I would not have thought to observe in any other recruit. Her weight distributed evenly across both feet, her hands relaxed rather than clenched, her breathing slow and controlled, in a way that suggested deliberate practice rather than natural calm. This was not the posture of someone nervous about their first evaluation. This was the posture of someone who had done this before, many times, in circumstances far removed from a padded training circle aboard a starship. Doyle raised his hand, signaling the start of the match, and for a brief moment, nothing happened. Reyes shifted his weight, testing the distance between himself and his opponent, clearly intending to ease into the match with a measured, controlled approach, befitting a standard evaluation. Kara Lang did not ease into anything. I will admit, in the interest of honesty, that what happened next unfolded too quickly for me to process in real time. My species relies heavily on visual processing that, while excellent for long-range observation and pattern recognition, does not match the reflexive speed of human close-quarters movement. I saw the beginning of Reyes's approach, a controlled step forward meant to establish distance and read his opponent's reaction. I saw Kara Lang respond, not with hesitation, not with the cautious testing movements I had expected from a new recruit facing an experienced opponent, but with an immediate, decisive closing of the distance between them that caught Reyes visibly off guard. The training deck fell silent around me. I heard Pratt draw in a sharp breath beside me, and I saw Marsh's eyes widen slightly as she watched the exchange unfold. Reyes, to his credit, adjusted quickly, his years of experience allowing him to recover from the unexpected opening and mount a proper defense. But something had shifted in the rhythm of the match, something I could not fully name, but could clearly feel in the tension that had settled over the gathered crew. Doyle watched the exchange without expression, his arms still folded, his eyes tracking every movement with the same careful attention he brought to every aspect of commanding this ship. I glanced toward him briefly, searching his face for some indication of surprise or concern, and found none. If anything, his expression carried a faint note of quiet satisfaction, as though he were witnessing exactly what he had expected to see, perhaps even exactly what he had hoped to see when he issued his order the day before. I turned my attention back to the match, determined to observe the remainder of the exchange as carefully as my senses allowed. What I witnessed over the following minutes would remain with me for the rest of my time aboard the Halcyon, and indeed, for the rest of my career studying the species that the wider galaxy had learned, through hard experience, to call Deathworlders. It was not simply that Kara Lang fought well, though she did. It was the manner in which she fought, the complete absence of hesitation, the total commitment to every movement, the way she seemed to treat the padded training circle, not as a controlled environment, with clear boundaries and medical safeguards, but as something far more consequential, something that demanded her full and undivided focus, regardless of the actual stakes involved. I found myself thinking back to the old assembly report I had reread the night before, the passage about species evolved under extreme survival pressure, failing to distinguish clearly between practice and reality. I had read that passage as an abstract academic curiosity for years. Standing at the edge of that training circle, watching a quiet young woman from a frontier settlement called Ashford Hollow move with a focus and intensity that seemed to belong to a battlefield rather than a training exercise, I finally understood what that passage had truly been describing. Doyle had given an order. No mercy in sparring. He had meant it, I would come to understand, as a standard of effort, a call for full commitment rather than half measures, the kind of instruction any experienced commander might give to ensure their crew trained properly for the dangers that awaited them beyond the safety of the ship. It was a phrase, a piece of motivational language meant to convey intensity without literal instruction. Kara Lang had not received it that way. She had received it as exactly what it said, no mercy. And in that moment, watching the match unfold before me with an intensity that left the entire gathered crew silent and still, I understood, with a growing sense of unease, that I could not fully suppress, that this quiet young recruit from a hostile frontier world did not appear to know how to receive an order any other way. The match was far from over, but already, something had changed in the atmosphere of the training deck, a shift I could feel in the tension of the crew around me, in the careful stillness of Doyle's expression, in the growing understanding that we were watching something far more significant than a routine evaluation. I did not yet know how the match would end. I did not yet know what this quiet, focused young woman was truly capable of, but I knew, standing there at the edge of that circle with my pulse quickening in a way it rarely did, that whatever I was about to witness would change the way I understood the crew of the Halcyon, and perhaps the way I understood humanity itself, for good. Reyes recovered from that first exchange faster than I expected, falling back on years of experience to reset the distance between himself and his opponent. He circled to the left, testing Kara's guard with a series of controlled strikes, each one measured, each one calculated, to probe for weakness rather than commit fully to an opening. This was, I understood from my months of observing human training exercises, the standard approach for an experienced fighter facing an unknown opponent, a careful process of gathering information before committing to a decisive strategy. Kara did not seem interested in this careful exchange of information. She absorbed the first two strikes with small, efficient adjustments of her stance, movements that cost her almost nothing in terms of position or balance, and on the third exchange, she closed the distance again, refusing to allow Reyes the space he needed to maintain his measured approach. I watched Doyle's expression shift slightly during this exchange, a small narrowing of his eyes that suggested he was recalculating something in his mind, some private assessment of the match unfolding in front of him. Beside me, Pratt had gone quiet, his earlier confident amusement replaced by a focused, almost wary attention that mirrored my own growing unease. The match continued for several more minutes, though minutes felt like an inadequate measure for what I was witnessing. Reyes fought with the accumulated skill of years of training, adapting his strategy repeatedly, as Kara refused to settle into any predictable pattern. Each time he found an approach that seemed to gain ground, she adjusted, not through hesitation or retreat, but through a kind of relentless recalibration that treated every failed attempt not as a setback, but simply as information to be used in her next attempt. I found myself struck, watching this unfold, by the complete absence of frustration or anger in her movements. My own species, when placed under sustained pressure in a contest of skill, tends toward visible emotional escalation, a narrowing focus that often comes paired with rising tension in posture and voice. Kara showed none of this. Her expression remained as level and unreadable as it had been since the moment she stepped off the shuttle in the receiving bay, her breathing controlled, her movements economical, as though the outcome of this match had already been decided in her mind, and she was simply working through the necessary steps to arrive at it. The end, when it came, arrived with a suddenness that left the gathered crew in stunned silence. Reyes, attempting a final decisive strike meant to end the match on his terms, found his effort redirected with a precision that seemed to require no visible strain from Kara at all. Within a matter of seconds, the match had concluded. Reyes secured in a controlled restraint hold that left him unable to continue, the standard signal for a decisive victory clear to everyone watching. Doyle called the match, his voice carrying the same level tone he used for every announcement, though I detected, or perhaps imagined, a faint undercurrent of something else beneath the professional calm. Kara released Reyes immediately upon the call, stepping back and offering him a hand to help him back to his feet, the gesture carrying none of the triumphant energy I might have expected from a recruit who had just decisively defeated one of the ship's most experienced crew members on her very first day. Reyes accepted the offered hand, pulling himself upright with a rueful expression that quickly shifted into something closer to genuine respect. "Ashford Hollow," he said, shaking his head slightly as he rubbed at his shoulder. "Should have believed the file." Kara offered no response beyond a small nod, and the training deck, which had fallen into near total silence during the final moments of the match, erupted into a low murmur of conversation as the gathered crew processed what they had just witnessed. I heard fragments of the discussion around me, comments about technique, about speed, about the sheer efficiency of her movements, but beneath the technical assessment, I sensed something else in the crew's reaction, a kind of recognition that went beyond simple admiration for a skilled fighter. Doyle stepped forward, addressing Kara directly, while the rest of the crew continued their quiet discussion around the edges of the training circle. "Good work, Lang," he said. "That's exactly the kind of commitment I want to see from every recruit on this ship." "Thank you, sir," Kara replied, her tone as level as it had been throughout the entire match. Doyle studied her for a moment longer, and I saw something pass across his face, a flicker of curiosity that mirrored my own growing questions about this quiet young woman. "Where did you train before you enlisted?" he asked. Kara hesitated, the first genuine hesitation I had seen from her since her arrival, before answering. "We didn't call it training, sir. Just how we grew up." Doyle nodded slowly, and I understood, watching the exchange, that this brief statement carried a weight that the surrounding crew, despite their admiration for her performance, did not fully grasp. I had spent enough time studying Deathworld species to recognize the significance of that phrase, the casual way she had dismissed years of what must have been constant, exhausting vigilance as simply how she grew up, as though survival itself had been indistinguishable from daily life on her homeworld. The training session continued for the remainder of the morning, with the other assigned pairings completing their own evaluations, though I found my attention repeatedly drawn back to Kara, who observed the remaining matches from the edge of the training deck with the same quiet, focused attention she brought to everything else. She offered occasional comments to the crew members near her, brief observations about technique or positioning that struck me, upon overhearing them, as remarkably insightful for someone so young, and, according to her file, entirely without formal combat training. I approached Doyle during a brief pause in the session, drawn by a need to understand what I had just witnessed, and what it might mean for my ongoing assessment of human military culture for the Assembly's records. "Commander," I said, keeping my voice low enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention. "May I ask you something about the order you gave this morning?" Doyle glanced at me, his expression neutral but not unwelcoming. "Go ahead, Thray." "When you said no mercy in sparring," I began, choosing my words carefully, "did you intend for it to be interpreted so literally?" Doyle was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting back toward the training deck, where the remaining matches continued. "I meant full effort," he said finally. "Full commitment. I didn't expect anyone to hold back out of misplaced kindness, especially not against a recruit who might need real feedback about where she stands." "And Lang's interpretation?" Doyle's expression shifted slightly, something thoughtful settling into the lines of his face. "I don't think Lang interpreted the order any differently than the rest of the crew, Thray. I think the rest of the crew has a line in their heads between training and reality, a line that lets them hold something back even when they're trying their hardest. I don't think Lang has that line. I don't think growing up on a world like Ashford Hollow leaves room for it." I considered this explanation carefully, turning it over in my mind alongside everything I had observed since Kara's arrival the previous day. "Is that dangerous, Commander? For the rest of the crew, training alongside someone who doesn't draw that distinction?" Doyle was quiet again, longer this time, before answering. "Maybe," he admitted. "But I'll tell you what's more dangerous, Thray. Sending a crew out into real danger who've spent their whole training career holding back, half committing, protecting each other from the discomfort of a hard lesson learned early. Out there, past this ship, the things we'll face aren't going to hold back for us. I'd rather have a crew that's already faced someone who fights like they mean it, even if that someone is standing on our side of the line." I did not have an immediate response to this, and Doyle, sensing the conversation had reached a natural pause, returned his attention to the ongoing training session, leaving me alone with my thoughts at the edge of the deck. I spent the remainder of the day compiling my initial observations from the morning's events, struggling, as I had struggled so often since my assignment to the Halcyon, to translate what I had witnessed into language that would make sense to my superiors back home. How do you explain in a formal assembly report that a single order, phrased in a way that any reasonable listener would understand as motivational rather than literal, had been received by one particular recruit as an exact and complete instruction? How do you explain that this recruit, barely more than a girl by human standards, had defeated one of the ship's most experienced fighters, not through exceptional technique alone, but through a complete and total commitment that left no room for hesitation, no room for the small mercies that even skilled combatants typically extend to their training partners? I did not find satisfactory answers to these questions that evening, and I suspected, based on everything I had learned about humanity during my time aboard the Halcyon, that I would not find satisfactory answers for some time yet. What I found instead, as I reviewed my notes late into the evening, was a growing certainty that I had witnessed something significant that day, something that would prove important, not just for my ongoing assessment of human military culture, but for the broader understanding my people would need to develop if our alliance with humanity was going to survive the tensions building along our shared border. I thought again of the old assembly report, the passage about Deathworld species failing to distinguish between practice and reality, and I found myself wondering, for the first time with genuine concern rather than academic curiosity, what would happen when Kara Lang, and others like her, faced a threat that was not confined to a padded training circle with medical staff standing by. I did not yet have an answer to that question. I would not have to wait long to find one, though the answer, when it finally arrived, would prove far more consequential than I could have imagined. That quiet evening, sitting alone in my quarters aboard the Halcyon, turning over the events of a single, ordinary morning that had, in truth, been anything but ordinary at all. Word of the morning's events traveled through the Halcyon with a speed that still surprised me, even after months of observing how quickly information moved among a human crew despite the absence of any formal announcement system for such things. By the time I made my way to the officers' mess for the evening meal, I found the topic of conversation at nearly every table centered on the same subject, delivered in hushed, animated tones that carried an unmistakable current of excitement beneath the surface. I settled into my usual seat near the observation window, a habit I had developed early in my posting, drawn to the quiet comfort of watching the stars pass by while I ate, and found myself joined almost immediately by Nandi, who slid into the seat across from me, with the barely contained energy of someone eager to discuss what she had heard. "You were there," she said, not quite a question, "on the training deck, this morning." I confirmed that I had been, and she leaned forward slightly, her earlier knowing look from the day before, now replaced with genuine, unguarded curiosity. "Is it true? Reyes went down in under 2 minutes?" I considered how best to answer this, aware that my Corvi sense of time, shaped by different biological rhythms than human perception, might not translate perfectly into her question. "The match concluded quickly," I said carefully, though I would not describe the outcome as simple. Nandy laughed, a genuine sound this time, free of the earlier undertone I had noticed. "That's Reyes for you. Man's been undefeated in evaluations for almost 2 years. Guess Ashford Hollow finally sent us someone who could match him." I studied her expression as she spoke, noting the enthusiasm rather than concern that colored her voice, and found myself once again confronted with the strange gap between how humans and my own species process displays of overwhelming capability. Where a Corvi officer might have approached such an event with caution, perhaps even wariness about what it revealed regarding a new crew member's potential volatility, Nandy and the rest of the crew seemed to treat it as something closer to entertainment, a point of pride even, that their ship had welcomed aboard someone capable of such a decisive performance. "Match, not defeat," I said, unable to resist the small correction, though I was not entirely certain why the distinction felt important to me. Reyes conceded through restraint, not through injury. "Sure," Nandy said, waving a hand dismissively, though not unkindly. "That's just how we say it around here. Doesn't mean it wasn't a real win." I did not press the point further, sensing that the distinction I was trying to draw mattered more to my own understanding of the events than it did to the broader cultural context I was still working to grasp. Instead, I asked her a question that had been forming in my mind since my conversation with Doyle earlier that day. "Has Commander Doyle given this order before? No mercy in sparring?" Nandy considered the question for a moment, her earlier enthusiasm giving way to something more thoughtful. "Not in those exact words. Not that I remember. He's always pushed us hard, but this felt like something new, more direct." "Do you know why?" She shrugged, though the gesture carried less dismissal than usual. "Command decisions aren't really explained to the rest of us, Thray. But if I had to guess, I'd say it has something to do with the reports coming out of the border sector. Things have been getting tenser out there. Maybe Doyle wants us sharper before we find out exactly how tense." This matched my own suspicions, gathered from fragments of briefing documents I had access to as the Assembly liaison, regarding increased threshold compact activity along the contested border regions. I did not share the specifics of what I knew with Nandy, bound as I was by the confidentiality requirements of my position, but the implications settled uncomfortably alongside everything else I had observed that day. Over the following week, the training deck became something of a gathering point during off-duty hours, as word of Kara's performance against Reyes spread, and curiosity about the new recruit grew among the crew. I found myself returning there often, driven by professional obligation, but increasingly, I had to admit to myself, by a personal fascination I had not expected to develop. The pattern that emerged during those days followed a similar shape each time. A crew member, having heard the stories or having witnessed a previous match, would request a sparring evaluation against Kara, framed always as professional curiosity, or a desire to test their own skills against a worthy opponent, though I suspected, in more than a few cases, that something closer to disbelief drove the request, a need to see for themselves whether the accounts they had heard could possibly be accurate. I watched perhaps a dozen of these matches over the following days, and though the specific details varied depending on each opponent's particular strengths and training background, the underlying pattern remained remarkably consistent. Kara approached every match with the same complete, unwavering commitment I had witnessed during her evaluation against Reyes, treating each opponent, regardless of their experience level or the informal nature of the request, with the same total focus that left no room for the small hesitations or half measures I observed in nearly every other sparring match aboard the ship. Pratt, despite his earlier casual amusement, requested his own match against her during the second week, motivated, he admitted to me afterward with a rueful laugh, by a stubborn refusal to believe that someone so young and quiet could truly be as formidable as the growing rumors suggested. He lasted longer than Reyes had, drawing on his considerable size and strength to press the match into its later stages. But the outcome, when it arrived, followed the same pattern, a decisive, controlled conclusion that left him laughing in disbelief rather than frustration, as Kara helped him back to his feet. "I don't understand it," he told me afterward, still catching his breath as we sat together near the edge of the training deck. "It's not just that she's fast, or strong for her size. Plenty of recruits are fast and strong. It's that she never stops adjusting. Every single thing I tried, she'd already moved past it by the time I finished trying it." I found his assessment matched my own observations closely, and I asked him a question that had been building in my mind since the first match against Reyes. "Does it concern you? Training alongside someone who fights with such total commitment?" Pratt considered the question seriously, his earlier amusement fading into something more thoughtful. "Concern isn't the right word," he said eventually. "It's more like relief, honestly. Out here, past this ship, we're going to run into things that won't care how tired we are, or how much we'd rather they went easy on us. Better to know now what real commitment looks like, from someone on our side, than to find out the hard way when it's too late to learn the lesson." This echoed Doyle's own explanation from the previous week almost exactly, and I began to understand, through these repeated conversations, that this perspective was not unique to the ship's commander, but represented something closer to a shared cultural understanding among the human crew, a philosophy of preparation that valued hard, honest lessons over comfortable, protected training, even when those lessons came at the cost of a bruised ego or a decisive defeat in front of watching crewmates. It was during the third week of this pattern that I found myself drawn into a conversation with Marsh, the communications officer whose earlier competitive comments had first alerted me to the significance of Doyle's order. She had, by this point, faced Kara in a match of her own, an encounter that had ended, like all the others, in a decisive and controlled conclusion, though Marsh, unlike some of her fellow crew members, approached the topic with a more measured, thoughtful perspective than the excited curiosity I had grown accustomed to hearing. "You've been watching pretty closely," she observed, joining me at my usual table in the officers' mess one evening. "More than just professional interest, I'd guess." I did not deny this, having grown comfortable enough with Marsh's directness over the previous months to appreciate, rather than deflect it. "I am trying to understand something," I admitted. "Something about how your species relates to the idea of holding back." Marsh nodded slowly, as though she had anticipated this line of questioning. "You mean why Lang doesn't seem to have an off switch?" The phrase struck me as an apt, if somewhat unsettling, description of what I had been struggling to articulate in my own observations. "Yes," I said, "precisely that." Marsh was quiet for a moment, considering her response carefully. "I grew up on a core world," she said eventually. "Comfortable place, by human standards. Never had to worry about the things kids from frontier settlements worry about, so I can't claim to understand Lang's background the way someone who grew up alongside her might, but I've served with a few people from places like Ashford Hollow over the years, and there's a pattern to it, if you watch closely enough." "What pattern?" "They don't separate the stakes," Marsh said. "For most of us, there's training, and there's real danger, and even when we push ourselves hard in training, some part of us knows the difference, knows there's a safety net underneath us. For people who grew up somewhere like Ashford Hollow, I don't think that safety net ever really existed, not the way it does for the rest of us. So when someone tells them to give full effort, they don't have a mental category for holding something back, because holding something back was never a survivable option where they came from." I turned this explanation over in my mind, finding it consistent with everything I had observed and everything I had read in the old assembly reports on Deathworld species, though hearing it articulated so clearly by a human crew member carried a different weight than reading it in an academic document. "Does this trouble you?" I asked, serving alongside someone who processes danger this way. Marsh considered the question for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the observation window and the passing stars beyond it. "Trouble isn't quite right," she said finally. "I think it makes me grateful, honestly, in a strange way, because whatever we run into out there, whatever the threshold compact throws at us if things keep escalating the way the reports suggest they might, I'd rather have someone like Lang standing beside me than not. I'd just rather not be the one on the other side of her when the moment comes that really matters." I did not have an immediate response to this observation, and Marsh, sensing the conversation had reached its natural conclusion, excused herself shortly afterward, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. I spent the remainder of that evening compiling a more detailed report for the assembly, drawing together the various threads of observation and conversation I had gathered over the preceding weeks, attempting, as I had attempted so many times before, to translate the growing unease building within me into language that would serve my superior's need for clear, actionable intelligence. I did not yet know, as I finally set aside my notes for the night, that the growing pattern I had been observing was about to encounter its most significant test, not on the padded floor of the training deck, but in circumstances far more consequential, circumstances that would arrive with none of the warning or ceremony that had preceded Kara Lang's carefully scheduled evaluation matches. I only knew, with a certainty that had been building steadily over the preceding weeks, that whatever awaited the Halcyon beyond the quiet routine of border patrol, the crew aboard this ship, and the strange, quiet young woman from Ashford Hollow in particular, would meet it with a level of readiness that few in the wider galaxy had ever encountered, and fewer still had ever survived encountering. The opportunity to speak with Kara directly did not arrive until nearly a month after her arrival aboard the Halcyon, a delay caused partly by her demanding training schedule and partly, I suspected, by my own hesitation, a lingering uncertainty about how to approach someone I had spent so many weeks studying from a careful, professional distance. The chance finally came during a quiet evening shift, when I found her alone in the observation deck, standing near the viewport with the same still, watchful posture I had first noticed in the receiving bay. "Officer Thray," she said, without turning, apparently having heard my approach despite the deliberate quiet of my footsteps. "Didn't expect company up here this late. I often find this deck peaceful during the evening cycle," I replied, moving to stand a respectful distance from her along the viewport. "I did not mean to intrude!" "You're not intruding," she said, and for the first time since her arrival, I heard something closer to warmth in her voice, a small easing of the careful reserve she carried in most of her interactions with the crew. "Figured you'd come find me eventually. You've been watching pretty closely since I got here." I considered denying this, out of some instinct toward professional discretion, but found the impulse fading quickly in the face of her direct, unguarded observation. "You are correct," I admitted. "I have been trying to understand something about your training, and about your homeworld, that I have struggled to grasp from records alone." Kara turned from the viewport to face me fully, studying me with the same careful attention she brought to everything, though I detected no wariness in her expression, only a quiet curiosity that matched my own. "Ask," she said simply. I hesitated, choosing my words with the same care I applied to every sensitive conversation during my posting aboard the Halcyon. "Commander Doyle's order," I said finally. "No mercy in sparring." Most of the crew understood it as an instruction toward greater effort, toward commitment. You appear to have understood it differently, more literally. Kara considered this for a long moment before responding, her gaze drifting briefly toward the viewport and the passing stars beyond it. "I don't think I understood it differently," she said eventually. "I think I just understood it completely. Most people leave a little room in an order like that. Room for judgment, room for deciding how far is far enough. Where I grew up, that room doesn't really exist. If you decide how far is far enough, and you're wrong, you don't get a second chance to reconsider." "Ashford Hollow," I said quietly. She nodded, a small economical movement. "Winters there don't give warnings. One day it's cold, and the next day the temperature drops fast enough to kill anyone caught outside without proper shelter. We had predators too, animals that learned to follow the settlement's edges, waiting for anyone careless enough to wander too far after dark. My parents used to say the Hollow doesn't punish mistakes, it just ends them." I found myself struck by the plain, matter-of-fact tone she used to describe circumstances that, by Corvi standards, would represent an almost unimaginable level of constant existential threat. "How did your people survive under such conditions?" "By not leaving room for half measures," she said. "Not in training, not in real danger, because eventually those two things stopped feeling different. When you're a kid learning to set a perimeter alarm because a hungry pack might be circling the settlement that night, you don't practice setting it halfway. You either do it right, completely, every single time, or eventually the night you got it wrong is the night that matters." I turned this explanation over carefully, recognizing in it the confirmation of everything I had suspected since first reading her curiously empty file weeks earlier. "Your file recorded none of this," I said. "No incidents, no notable events. I found this absence troubling when I first reviewed it." Kara offered a small, humorless smile, the first genuine expression of dark amusement I had seen from her since her arrival. "Nothing to record," she said. "Surviving isn't an incident, Officer Thray. It's just Tuesday. You don't write a report every time nothing bad happens, even when nothing bad happening took everything you had to make sure of it." I considered this statement for a long moment, feeling something settle into place within my understanding of humanity that I had been circling without fully grasping for weeks. "Commander Doyle believes this makes you valuable, in circumstances the ship may soon face." "Maybe," Kara said, turning back toward the viewport. "I just know I don't know how to do it any other way. When someone tells me to give full effort, I don't have a setting between full and less than full. Never needed one. Never had the luxury of building one." I did not have an immediate response to this, and we stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the stars pass beyond the viewport. It was Kara who eventually broke the silence, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity I had not expected. "What about your people?" she asked. "Corvi. Do you have a word for what I am? Something like Deathworlder?" I hesitated before answering, aware of the sensitivity surrounding the term and its history within assembly diplomatic circles. "We have studied Deathworld species for generations," I said carefully. "Your homeworld and others like it produce survivors whose instincts our own gentler evolutionary history did not require us to develop. The term carries complicated associations within assembly discourse, some rooted in genuine scientific curiosity, others rooted in something closer to caution, even fear." Kara nodded slowly, apparently unsurprised by this explanation. "Fear makes sense," she said. "People are usually afraid of things they don't understand, especially when those things turn out to be stronger than expected in ways that matter." "Are you troubled by this?" I asked, "knowing that other species view your kind with such caution?" She considered the question seriously before answering. "Not troubled," she said eventually. "Just aware. I think it's fair, honestly. I think if I met someone from a world like Ashford Hollow for the first time, and I didn't grow up understanding how that world shapes a person, I'd probably be a little cautious too." Our conversation continued for a while longer, touching on lighter subjects, her curiosity about Corvi culture and homeworld, my own careful, professional answers, offered with the same warmth I had grown to feel toward this quiet, formidable young woman over the preceding weeks. When I finally excused myself to return to my quarters, I found my earlier unease had not disappeared entirely, but had transformed into something more complex. A growing respect layered uneasily alongside a persistent awareness of exactly what kind of capability the Halcyon now carried among its crew. The following weeks brought a new development that would test my growing understanding in ways I had not anticipated. A diplomatic delegation from a neighboring species within the Assembly, the Varan Concord, arrived aboard the Halcyon as part of a scheduled inspection tour meant to assess the effectiveness of the human alliance for their own government's ongoing deliberations about deepening cooperation with humanity. Among the delegation was a senior military attaché, a formidable Varan officer named Cass Iridel, whose reputation for skill in personal combat had been established across several assembly worlds before his current diplomatic assignment. Iridel, upon learning of the training deck's reputation and the stories that had begun circulating about the quiet human recruit who had defeated every crew member who challenged her, requested, through official diplomatic channels, the opportunity to observe and potentially participate in a sparring evaluation, framed carefully as an exercise in cross-species military cooperation and mutual understanding. Doyle, after some consideration and consultation with the ship's senior officers, agreed to the request, though I detected, in the careful, measured way he discussed the arrangement, a certain wariness about the diplomatic implications, should the exercise not proceed as smoothly as everyone hoped. I found myself once again standing at the edge of the training deck on the appointed day, joined this time not only by the usual gathering of curious crew members, but by the full Varan delegation, their formal robes and careful diplomatic bearing standing in stark contrast to the practical training uniforms of the human crew surrounding them. Iridel himself cut an imposing figure, his species' natural physical advantages, greater height, and denser muscle mass than the human standard, evident even beneath his formal attire as he stepped onto the padded circle across from Kara. I watched this new match unfold with a different kind of attention than I had brought to the earlier evaluations, aware that the outcome carried implications extending well beyond the training deck itself, implications that would shape how an entire neighboring species understood the true nature of the alliance my own people had entered into with humanity. What I witnessed over the following minutes would prove, in its own way, even more significant than the match against Reyes weeks earlier, though not for the reasons I might have expected when the exercise first began. Iridel opened the match with the confident, controlled aggression I had come to expect from Varen combat training, a style built around leveraging superior size and strength to overwhelm an opponent quickly, before subtlety or endurance could become factors in the outcome. For the first several exchanges, this approach seemed to be working, Kara giving ground steadily under the sheer physical pressure of his attacks, her expression betraying nothing beyond the same focused concentration she brought to every match. I watched the gathered Varen delegation exchange quiet, satisfied glances as the early exchanges unfolded, clearly interpreting Kara's tactical retreat as the beginning of an inevitable conclusion. Doyle, standing at the edge of the circle with his usual folded arms and unreadable expression, showed no such concern, and I found myself, based on everything I had learned over the preceding weeks, trusting his calm more than the confident assumptions of the watching delegation. The shift, when it came, arrived with the same sudden decisiveness I had witnessed in every previous match. Kara, having absorbed and studied the full pattern of Iridel's aggressive approach through those early exchanges, found the gap in his technique that his size and strength had allowed him to overlook, a moment of overextension that a smaller, more disciplined opponent could exploit. She closed the distance completely, using his own forward momentum against him in a controlled redirection that brought the imposing Varen officer down to the padded floor with a speed that left the gathered delegation visibly stunned. The restraint that followed was, as always, precise and controlled, causing no lasting harm beyond a thoroughly bruised sense of confidence, and Iridel, to his considerable credit, accepted the outcome with genuine grace, rising to his feet and offering Kara a formal Varen gesture of respect that I recognized as reserved for only the most impressive displays of combat skill within their culture. "Remarkable," he said, addressing Doyle rather than Kara directly, in keeping with Varen diplomatic protocol regarding formal acknowledgments. "I withdraw any reservations my government held regarding the tactical value of this alliance." The diplomatic implications of that single statement, delivered before the full Varen delegation and relayed, I would later learn, in detailed reports back to their homeworld, proved significant enough to accelerate several stalled negotiations regarding deeper assembly cooperation with the human coalition. I mention this not to suggest that a single sparring match determined the course of interstellar diplomacy, but to illustrate how thoroughly the pattern I had been observing for weeks had begun to ripple outward, shaping perceptions and decisions well beyond the padded floor of the Halcyon's training deck. I did not have long to reflect on these diplomatic ripples, however, because within days of the Varen delegation's departure, the quiet routine that had defined my months aboard the Halcyon shattered completely, replaced by a crisis that would test everything I had learned about this remarkable young recruit in circumstances far removed from the careful, controlled environment of scheduled evaluations. The alarm sounded during the ship's late evening cycle, a pattern of tones I had never heard before during my posting, distinct from the earlier false alarm regarding the derelict transport, carrying an urgency that brought the entire crew to immediate readiness within seconds. I was in my quarters reviewing diplomatic correspondence when the tones began, and I reached the bridge within minutes, finding Doyle already at his command station, his earlier calm replaced by a focused intensity that immediately confirmed my worst suspicions. "Report," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual measured ease. Nandy's voice came back sharp and immediate. "Multiple contacts, sir. Threshold compact configuration, emerging from concealment along our starboard approach. They've been running silent. Must have been tracking us for hours." I felt something cold settle through me as I processed this information, understanding immediately the significance of what Nandy had reported. The Threshold Compact, the coalition of hostile species along the contested border, did not typically engage in silent tracking and ambush tactics against routine patrol vessels. Such an approach suggested deliberate, planned aggression, a calculated strike rather than a chance encounter. Options, Doyle said, his eyes fixed on the tactical display now filling the main view screen. 3 vessels, sir, came the reply from the tactical station. Configuration suggests boarding intent rather than direct engagement. They want the ship, not just to destroy it. I understood, hearing this assessment, exactly why such a strategy might appeal to a Threshold Compact commander. A captured human warship, its systems and technology intact, would represent an intelligence prize of enormous value, particularly given the growing tensions along the border, and the Compact's evident interest in understanding exactly what advantages the Assembly's new human allies might bring to any future conflict. Doyle's response came without hesitation, a series of rapid commands that set the entire ship into motion, defensive systems activating, non-essential crew moving towards secured positions, weapons crews reaching their stations with the same practiced efficiency I had observed during every drill exercise over the preceding months. I found myself moving toward the secured observation position designated for non-combat personnel, my role as diplomatic liaison offering no useful function during active combat operations, though my attention remained fixed on the unfolding crisis, with an intensity that made the designated safety of my position feel almost unbearable. The initial exchange of fire lasted only minutes before the Threshold Compact vessels, having clearly planned their approach with detailed knowledge of the Halcyon's defensive capabilities, executed a coordinated strike against the ship's primary shield generators, a strike that succeeded in creating exactly the kind of vulnerability their boarding strategy required. I felt the ship shudder around me as the shields failed along a section of the lower decks, and within seconds, the alarm pattern shifted again, a new, more urgent tone that I had learned during my training aboard the Halcyon to recognize immediately. Boarders, the Threshold Compact forces were coming aboard. I made my way, against every protocol governing my designated safety position, toward the nearest secure communication terminal, driven by a need to understand what was unfolding, rather than remain isolated from information during what I understood, with growing dread, to be the most significant crisis the Halcyon had faced during my entire posting. What I learned, monitoring the frantic exchange of tactical communications over the following minutes, confirmed my worst fears, while also revealing something I had not fully anticipated, despite everything I had witnessed over the preceding weeks regarding the quiet, formidable young recruit from Ashford Hollow. Kara Lang, according to the fragmented reports reaching the bridge, had been among the first crew members to encounter the boarding party, caught in the lower decks during a routine equipment check when the Threshold Compact forces breached the compromised section of the hull, where a less experienced or less thoroughly prepared crew member might have retreated toward the nearest secure position, following standard protocol until reinforcements could arrive. The reports reaching the bridge described something entirely different, unfolding in those lower corridors. Something that Doyle, listening to the same fragmented updates with an expression I had never seen on his face before, seemed to receive not with surprise, but with a grim, focused recognition of exactly what his earlier training order had been preparing the ship for all along. The lower corridors of the Halcyon were narrow, built for efficient movement between engineering sections rather than open combat, a fact that I would later understand had played directly into the advantage of a defender who fought with total, immediate commitment rather than cautious, measured engagement. The Threshold Compact boarding party, trained for coordinated assaults against defenders who would fall back, regroup, and mount an organized resistance, found themselves instead facing an opponent who closed the distance immediately, who gave them no time to establish the kind of tactical control their training had prepared them to seize. Pratt, who had been working nearby in an adjacent engineering section when the breach occurred, reached the corridor within minutes, arriving to find a scene that he would later describe to me, once the crisis had passed, with a kind of stunned, quiet reverence that I had not heard in his voice before. Kara had used the narrow confines of the corridor itself as a tool, funneling the boarding party into a position where their numerical advantage could not translate into an effective assault, meeting each combatant with the same complete, unwavering focus she had shown in every training match over the preceding weeks, except now, with the stakes no longer confined to a padded circle with medical staff standing by, That focus carried a different, more consequential weight. I did not witness these events directly, confined as I was to the secure observation position on the bridge, but the reports reaching Doyle over the following minutes painted a clear picture of what had unfolded. Kara had held the compromised section of the corridor, delaying the boarding party's advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive and for the ship's security teams to establish a proper defensive perimeter, an achievement that, according to the tactical assessment compiled afterward, had prevented the threshold compact forces from reaching the ship's primary systems, the very objective their entire boarding strategy had been designed to secure. Doyle received these updates with the same grim, focused expression, issuing rapid commands to coordinate the ship's broader defensive response, directing security teams to reinforce the position Kara had held, and to begin the systematic process of repelling the remaining boarding forces from the compromised sections of the lower decks. I watched him work with an efficiency that matched everything I had come to understand about human command culture during my months aboard the Halcyon, a calm, focused competence that seemed to draw strength rather than panic from the crisis unfolding around us. The engagement, in total, lasted less than an hour, though it felt considerably longer standing at my secure position, monitoring the fragmented updates and trying, with limited success, to piece together a complete picture of events I could not directly observe. By the time the final threshold compact forces had been repelled, either captured or forced to retreat back toward their own vessels, as the Halcyon's restored defensive systems began to press the advantage, the immediate crisis had passed, leaving behind a ship damaged but intact, a crew shaken but largely unharmed, and a growing understanding, spreading through every level of the Halcyon's command structure, of exactly how significant a role Kara Lang's early, decisive action in those lower corridors had played in preventing what could have been a far more catastrophic outcome. I made my way down to the lower decks once the all-clear had been sounded, driven by the same need to understand and witness firsthand that had guided my behavior throughout my entire posting aboard the Halcyon. I found Kara there, standing quietly amid the aftermath of the engagement, speaking with the ship's medical officer about a minor injury to her arm that she dismissed with the same understated calm she brought to everything else. Doyle arrived shortly after I did, moving through the assembled security teams and medical staff with quiet words of acknowledgement for each crew member he passed, before finally reaching Kara. He studied her for a long moment, the same unreadable expression from her first day aboard the ship settling across his features, before speaking. "You held that corridor alone for almost 4 minutes before Pratt arrived," he said, "against a coordinated boarding party trained for exactly this kind of engagement." "Yes, sir," Kara replied, her tone carrying the same level, matter-of-fact quality it always did, as though she were reporting the results of a routine equipment check, rather than describing an action that had likely prevented the capture of the entire ship. Doyle nodded slowly, and I saw something pass across his face that I recognized, having spent weeks studying this quiet, complicated man, as genuine, unguarded respect. "That order I gave, weeks ago," he said. "No mercy in sparring. I gave it because I suspected we might face exactly this kind of situation before too long, and I wanted this crew ready for it. I didn't expect to be proven right quite this quickly, or quite this clearly." Kara considered this for a moment before responding, and when she spoke, her words carried a simplicity that struck me, standing nearby and listening, as somehow the perfect summary of everything I had spent the preceding weeks trying to understand about her, and about humanity more broadly. "I just did what the training taught me, sir," she said. "Full effort, every time. Didn't know any other way to do it." I stood at the edge of that damaged corridor, surrounded by the quiet aftermath of a crisis that had tested everything I had observed and struggled to understand since Kara Lang's arrival aboard the Halcyon weeks earlier, and I found myself confronting a realization that would shape my understanding of humanity for the remainder of my career studying this remarkable, unsettling, and ultimately invaluable species. The order Doyle had given, the phrase that had seemed, to my own careful academic understanding, like a simple piece of motivational rhetoric, had in fact represented something far more profound about the nature of the alliance my own people had entered into. A preparation not just for the physical demands of combat, but for a fundamental philosophy of readiness that treated every moment, whether confined to a padded training circle or unfolding in the desperate reality of a boarding action, with exactly the same complete, unwavering commitment. I did not yet know, standing in that quiet corridor amid the aftermath of the crisis, exactly how this realization would shape the report I would eventually send back to the assembly, or how it would influence the broader understanding my own people would need to develop regarding the true nature of the species we had chosen as allies. I only knew, with a certainty that had been building steadily since that first sparring match against Reyes weeks earlier, that I had witnessed something the wider galaxy would need to understand fully, and soon, if the growing tensions along the border were to be navigated successfully in the difficult months that surely lay ahead. In the days following the attack, the Halcyon underwent repairs at a nearby assembly way station, a quiet interval that gave the crew time to process what had happened, and gave me, in turn, the space I needed to finally begin compiling the report I had been struggling to write for weeks. I spent long hours in my quarters, reviewing my notes from the very first day of Kara Lang's arrival through to the final tense minutes of the boarding action, searching for the language that would allow my superiors back home to understand what I had witnessed without diminishing its significance through overly cautious academic phrasing. I found Doyle one evening during this period of repair, standing alone on the observation deck where I had first spoken privately with Kara weeks earlier, watching the slow, methodical work of repair crews visible through the reinforced viewport. He acknowledged my approach with a small nod, and we stood together in comfortable silence for a while before he spoke. "You've been quiet since the attack, Thray," he observed. "Quieter than usual, even for you." "I have been trying to understand what I witnessed," I admitted. "Not just the events themselves, but what they mean for the alliance between our peoples going forward." Doyle considered this, his gaze remaining fixed on the repair crews beyond the viewport. "And what have you concluded?" I chose my words carefully, aware that this conversation, more than any other during my posting aboard the Halcyon, would shape the final content of the report I intended to send home. "I have spent my career studying Deathworld species," I said. "Understanding, in an academic sense, the survival pressures that shape species like your own. I believed, before my posting aboard this ship, that this academic understanding was sufficient preparation for working alongside humanity. Now I understand that academic knowledge and lived understanding are entirely different things," I said. "I read, many times, that Deathworld species fail to distinguish clearly between practice and reality. I understood this as an interesting behavioral pattern, worth noting in a formal report. I did not understand, until I watched Kara Lang defend that corridor with the same complete commitment she brought to a training match weeks earlier, exactly what that failure to distinguish actually means, in practice, when the stakes become real." Doyle was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a thoughtfulness I had not often heard from him during my months aboard the ship. "I think that's the thing most species outside humanity struggle to grasp," he said. "It's not that we don't feel fear, or that we don't understand the difference between a training exercise and a real threat on some level. It's that our instincts, the deep ones, the ones shaped by generations of ancestors who didn't survive by drawing careful distinctions, don't always listen to that understanding." Lang didn't hold back in that corridor because some part of her genuinely couldn't hold back, not because she was reckless, but because holding back was never a survivable strategy for the world that raised her. I nodded slowly, absorbing this explanation alongside everything else I had learned during my posting. "The wider galaxy has a word for this," I said. "Deathworlder. I have always understood it as a term carrying caution, even fear. I am beginning to understand it may also carry something closer to gratitude, for those fortunate enough to stand on the same side of the line as your species rather than against it." Doyle offered a small, genuine smile at this observation, the first I had seen from him since before the attack. "That's about the most honest assessment of us I've heard from an outsider, Thray. I'll take it." I found Kara later that same evening, in her quarters, recovering from the minor injury she had sustained during the boarding action, though her demeanor carried none of the discomfort I might have expected. She greeted me with the same quiet warmth that had characterized our earlier conversation on the observation deck, and we spoke for a while about the aftermath of the attack, about the ongoing repairs, about the growing awareness throughout the ship of exactly how significant her actions in that lower corridor had proven to be. "You're writing your report," she observed, not quite a question, near the end of our conversation. "I am," I confirmed. I have struggled with it for weeks, trying to find language that would properly convey what I have witnessed aboard this ship. What are you going to say? She asked, her curiosity genuine, rather than anxious. I considered the question carefully before answering, aware that I was, in that moment, finally articulating the conclusion I had been circling since the very first day of her arrival aboard the Halcyon. I am going to say that my people have spent generations studying Deathworld species from a careful academic distance, cataloging survival instincts and behavioral patterns as though they were simply data to be recorded and understood, I said. I am going to say that this distance has prevented us from truly grasping what an alliance with a species like yours actually means, not in terms of tactical advantage or diplomatic leverage, but in terms of the quiet, complete commitment that shapes every action, every decision, every moment, whether the stakes are confined to a training circle or unfold in the desperate reality of a boarding action. Kara listened to this with the same careful, focused attention she brought to everything, and when I finished, she offered a small, thoughtful nod. "Sounds about right," she said, "though I'd add one thing, if you don't mind the suggestion. Please." "Tell them it's not something to be afraid of," she said, "not if they're standing beside us. I understand why the rest of the galaxy might look at people like me and feel uneasy. I understand the history behind that word, Deathworlder, and everything it carries. But Commander Doyle didn't give that order to make us dangerous to our allies. He gave it to make sure that when the moment came, and it always comes eventually, we'd be ready. That readiness isn't a threat to anyone standing on our side of the line. It's the whole reason anyone standing on our side of the line gets to keep standing there at all." I carried these words with me as I returned to my quarters that evening, finally sitting down to complete the report I had struggled with for so many weeks, a report that would eventually shape not just my own career studying humanity, but a meaningful portion of the Assembly's broader understanding of the alliance we had entered into with this remarkable, unsettling, and ultimately invaluable species. The Halcyon returned to active patrol duty within days, its repairs complete, its crew rested and ready, carrying with them all the quiet lessons of the preceding months. I remained aboard for the remainder of my posting, continuing to observe and document human military culture with a depth of understanding I could not have achieved through academic study alone, and I found myself, more often than I would have expected when I first arrived aboard this ship, grateful for the strange, demanding, and ultimately clarifying experience of serving alongside a crew shaped by a homeworld that had never allowed them the luxury of holding anything back. I think often, even now, long after my posting aboard the Halcyon concluded, of that first quiet morning when Commander Doyle stood before his assembled crew and issued an order he believed to be simple, even routine, a call for full commitment during training exercises meant to prepare his people for the dangers that awaited them beyond the safety of their ship. I think of how that simple order, received by most of the crew as familiar, if intense, guidance, was received by one quiet young woman from a frontier settlement called Ashford Hollow as something far more absolute, a complete and total instruction that left no room for the small mercies the rest of the galaxy had long assumed were simply part of how any reasonable species approached the boundary between practice and reality. The wider galaxy has long spoken of humanity with a mixture of caution and unease, a species that emerged from conditions so hostile that survival itself required instincts other species had never needed to develop. I understand now, in a way that no amount of academic study could have taught me, exactly why that caution exists, and exactly why it should never be mistaken for something closer to fear. Humanity does not draw the same lines the rest of us draw, between training and reality, between caution and commitment, between what is required and what is simply, completely, given. It is a difference that unsettled me deeply when I first arrived aboard the Halcyon, and it is a difference I have come, in the months and years since, to regard as one of the most valuable qualities any ally could possibly bring to a growing alliance, facing an uncertain and increasingly dangerous future. The commander ordered no mercy in sparring, meaning only to demand full effort from his crew. The Deathworld girl from Ashford Hollow took it seriously, in the complete and literal sense that her world had never allowed her to understand any other way. And in doing so, she did not simply win a training match, or even successfully defend a compromised corridor during a genuine crisis. She taught an entire ship, and through my own careful halting report, a significant portion of the wider galaxy. Exactly what it means when a species raised on the edge of survival finally stands beside you, rather than against you, and gives everything, completely, without ever once considering the possibility of holding anything back.